Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Chris Sherrington. I'm the Head of Environmental Policy and Economics at Eunomia Research and Consulting, based in the UK. And we have been commissioned by TÜÇEM to undertake a study to explore the design options for a deposit return scheme in Turkey, to try and determine what, learning from best practice around the world, what would be the features of a well-functioning system in Turkey. So how can we design a really good system for Turkey? So just a little bit about us. We're based in the UK. We have 4 offices in the UK. We have about 70 staff overall, lots of economists, lots of consultants specializing in all aspects of waste prevention and management. We have another European office in Brussels and another recently set up in Athens. We have an office in New York and a long-standing office in Auckland. Now, in recent years, a lot of our work has focused on deposit return schemes. So we have really good experience from around the world of many different schemes. We have a really good understanding of the features of those schemes, what makes them work, and which ones work less well, and what the reason is for that. So they're very, as Rauno mentioned, there's a lot of similarities in the mechanisms of deposits, but when it comes down to the local specifics of how it's implemented, it's really important to get it right. So, previous speakers have mentioned what a deposit return scheme is. And they are typically applied to beverage containers, but the mechanism can be applied to other items as well. I think small waste electronic items is another area where a deposit can be very useful to get things back. And of key importance is this mechanism. Now, this is very different from being paid to recycle. It is not simply a reward for recycling. Now, the evidence shows that if you just pay people money to recycle, it's not particularly effective. The real strength of a deposit is that people pay the money up front and they want to get it back. Now, we know from academic theory, prospect theory, we know that people will work harder to avoid a loss than to obtain a gain. So they work harder to avoid a loss of the same value than to seek a gain. So this is why deposits are really effective. People want to get their money back. And this is the important thing. It's not a tax. People get their money back. And the two overriding elements of the sort of the intention behind these schemes is both to reduce litter and to get really good levels of high quality recycling. But I think as Clarissa alluded to, in recent years, a lot of the public concern and the political appetite for putting in place deposit return schemes has been in response to litter, and principally litter when it's in the marine environment. We've seen an incredible upswelling of concern about this issue, and it's not hard to see why. When you see littered plastic items on a beach or in the sea, it's just wrong. There's this clear juxtaposition of this otherwise pristine natural environment with these man-made items that shouldn't be there, and they don't need to be there. Particularly when it comes to beverage containers, we have the ability to keep hold of these things. We have the mechanisms to make sure things don't end up in the sea. This is an infographic that we did about 3.5 years ago now, based on the best available evidence on where plastics in the marine environment come from and where they go. At the time, there's a lot of excitement about something called the ocean cleanup, going to the middle of the Pacific and picking up plastic, because apparently lots of the plastic ended up in the Pacific. When I first heard of this, I thought, well, that seems like a sensible idea. If it all ends up in the Pacific, we just pick it up. But it doesn't. Most of it actually sinks to the ocean floor. And of the stuff that still floats, there's not much. There is no island in the middle of the oceans. It's more a soup. You can't see it. You can't walk on it. You can't just go and pick it up. It really is small fragments. So if you're going to deal with litter that's already in the environment, beaches. Beaches is where you should focus. The concentration of plastics on beaches is much higher than in the middle of the ocean. But obviously much better than that is to prevent it getting there in the first place and to seek high quality recycling at the same time. But this is what has really captured the public attention, not just globally, but in particular at the EU level. And we've seen Clarissa explain the action that the Commission and the Parliament and the Council have taken on this. So we actually did, Eunomia, my company, we did the work underpinning, the analysis underpinning the Single-Use Plastics Directive. And I can, yes, it was a lot of work in a short period of time. There are quite a lot of demands on us doing this. But one of the key things was looking at what are the littered items on beaches. So what we see here is of all the items on beaches, 82% of all the items by number of items are plastic. The vast majority of that plastic is general plastic, so not fishing plastic. So this is 55% of everything is general plastic. And 49% of everything on beaches is single-use plastics. So when the Commission are targeting single-use plastic items, they're targeting a significant proportion of what is found on beaches. So looking closely at this, we can see some of the individual item types that are found. So the most prominent one, drinks bottles, caps and lids. And then we have cigarette butts. Now this is counting by number. Now you can fit many, many cigarette butts into a plastic bottle. So when you count by number, it's very different from considering the volume of these items. And from what we understand, the thing people don't like about litter in the environment is seeing it. It's the visual impact. It's seeing lots of it. So I think plastic beverage containers, they're highly visible and people know that they will travel over the sea as well. So in terms of visible impact, they are up there. We looked at lots of other items as well. The ones in yellow with the arrows marked flushables, these are items that are flushed down the toilet and enter the marine environment through the sewers, through the sewer networks. So these are things like the cotton bud sticks and sanitary applications as well. And this pattern is replicated at the global level. This is from the International Coastal Cleanup. I think this is the 2016 or the 2017 figures. And we can see here, again, this is by item count. So the top item by number is cigarette butts. But then we have plastic beverage bottles, and then we have plastic bottle caps, we have glass beverage bottles, and metal bottle caps. So if we were to then, it's an interesting example of how you split categories and the impression that gives. Firstly, we know by volume, the beverage containers would be up the top, but also if you then put the different categories of beverage container together, the numbers just on item count alone will be well in excess of the cigarette butts. So this is not to say that cigarette butts aren't being tackled. I think, as Clarissa mentioned, there is extended producer responsibility for cigarette butts as well. So the tobacco manufacturers at the European level will be having to pay towards the costs of litter cleanup for cigarette butts. So much of the focus has been on plastic and on the marine environment, but it's really important not to overlook land-based litter as well, and not just the visual impact of it, but we do know the visual impact is upsetting. People don't like their communities to be littered. I think in part it's a sense of disempowerment, feeling that this area that you'd like to see clean, other people beyond your control, it is being littered. And with things like glass as well, you have the potential for injury. It's also very expensive to clean up. And we have, I'm an economist, and economists often use very ugly language, and this is a term that economists use called disamenity, and it means how upset people are about the state of their local environment. But where economists get interested is that people will put a monetary value on this. So there's been some research from academics in the UK exploring what are the issues that people don't like about their neighbourhood. And litter is always up there. And they found that they were willing to pay a lot of money for a cleaner environment. They were showing images of different grades of increased cleanliness. And so this is not to say you should spend this amount of money cleaning it up, because in economic terms you'd be back to where you started with. You want to spend as little money as possible, as efficiently and as fairly as possible on cleaning this up to get the greatest welfare gain, the greatest sense of improved happiness, if you like. So beyond the examples for Europe and Australia, the US has a number of deposit schemes, and many of these were put in a long time ago. They were put in the 1970s and 80s. And I think it's fair to say that some of the design features in schemes in American states, not all of them, I think Oregon has a very good scheme, but a lot of them are examples of practice that we would not recommend elsewhere. So we'll come on to this later, but in general terms, the way they're set up in law, they fix certain aspects of the scheme that you'd want to be able to vary, and this constrains the effectiveness of the scheme. Canada also has widespread coverage and a long experience of having deposits as well. So to come to the design options, and this is a large part of the work we'll be doing for Turkey, we'll be looking at the design options in other countries and exploring how these could best be applied to Turkey to get the most efficient scheme. So in terms of the governance of the scheme, you can make a broad distinction between those which are run by the state, owned and run by the state, and those which are owned and run by industry. But importantly, where it's run by industry, you still need the oversight. And this has implications for the design flexibility of the scheme and the ability for the scheme to adapt. There's also the choice of whether you have a central operator or a more decentralized system. Now, the example of Estonia, you have one central operator. There are examples elsewhere where you don't have this central operator, and I'll talk a little bit later on about what that means. Rauno mentioned fraud and the challenge of fraud. It's because the incentive is there, you have to balance the risk of fraud against the level of the return that you might want, and you've got to make the system effective. And it's never possible to 100% guarantee that all fraud everywhere will be eliminated. You can try, you can get really close, but there's always going to be someone thinking about how to deal with it. So the way to do it, to think about it, is to think of it as a cost to be minimized, to be managed, and you wouldn't want to spend more on preventing fraud than you might risk losing through fraud. So again, it's a sensible sort of comparison of the costs and benefits of how far do you go. Statutory targets are also important. You do need, schemes can achieve 90% return rate, we know that. But you do need that statutory target, particularly where it's an industry-owned and run scheme, or actually, indeed, if it is a state-run scheme, you need an incentive to get the higher rates. And I'll explain a bit why later on. So all of these issues have implications for producer responsibility. We heard earlier on, I think Clarissa was giving the example of end-of-life management of items in Europe, including the litter costs. And it's really important to just emphasize this distinction, which is something in the UK, for a long time, people didn't realize that producers weren't paying for end-of-life management of a lot of packaging. In the UK, we still have a system, it will be changing, we have a system where producers only pay 10% of the end-of-life costs of the items they place on the market, the items they sell. So 90% of the costs are being covered by citizens, by taxpayers. So we don't have the incentive on the producers to deliver things in an efficient way because they're not covering the costs, so the incentives aren't aligned. Now, as we saw with the European Commission, they emphasised the importance of extended producer responsibility, which not only means that consumers pay rather than citizens, and they can be one and the same, but you can be a citizen and not consume much, but some consumers consume a lot. So it's right that you get the fairness through that. And also, when the producers and the consumers are paying, they're the ones with the greatest level of control. They have full control throughout the system to try and minimize the costs for everyone. Transparency and accountability are essential. In the Estonian example, we have the ministry has oversight. There are requirements on the central system operator to be transparent in all its dealings, and data is at the heart of this. And efficiency and ultimately the system success depend upon the mechanisms put in place, depend upon the management of the data, and having, as we'll see, one system operator with a clear view of everything that's going on. So just to give some examples of good and less good practice. So in terms of governance, the Norwegian system is run by a central operator called Infinitum, and this covers all the logistics, it manages all the data and all the finances. It's a system that is set up and owned by industry, and it's not for profit. As it's owned by the industry, by the producers would not want this scheme that they own to make any excess profit, because it would mean that they were paying more for it. So the idea is that this scheme operator is continually seeking to achieve greater efficiencies and reduce the cost for the owners, who are the producers, the beverage producers and the retailers. And these producers and the retail representatives are on the board, so they have the control of the system. So Infinitum ensures compliance, ensures everyone's paying what they should be, and ensures that the correct fees are paid. And the government provides an incentive not only to achieve a 90% return rate, but to go beyond. Now, Norway is a really interesting example where the government didn't say, you must put in place a deposit system. They never told industry, you must put it in place. So in effect, it is a voluntary approach by industry, but it is a voluntary approach in response to a really strong tax incentive to put it in place. And I'll talk about this later, but in brief, the higher the return rate for the beverage containers, the less tax you pay. So another good example is Estonia, which operates in many respects a similar model to Norway, different materials covered. And here, in terms of, sort of the government oversight, you have the potential for criminal penalties for non-compliance as well. So different approaches are seen elsewhere, and Connecticut in the USA, there is no single operator. So no single entity has responsibility for the operation and ultimately the success of the system. So it's left to the individual beverage companies to organize their own logistics and the money flows. The government designed the specification in legislation, so many of the aspects are fixed, such as the handling fee paid to retailers and the producer fee, and indeed the level of the deposit. But the one thing they didn't set was a target. So there is no target for high level return rate, and there's very limited oversight. What this means is no clear view as to how the costs are apportioned, and the sense is for many that it's just not done fairly. So in Hawaii, you have another type of system again. It's run by the state. So again, this is the public bodies representing citizens running the scheme. This is not producer responsibility. There is a fee from consumers that part funds it, but it's part funded as well by taxpayers. So this is not a pure system of extended producer responsibility. I'm not going to talk through every aspect of this diagram, but I think the thing I'd like to point out is that the central system operator here, all the information flows to them. They have the clear overview of everything that's being placed on the market, everything that's being returned. And that's actually really important in terms of a method of fraud detection. They have really good understanding of what's being sold where and what's being returned where, so you can then spot, you have algorithms to spot any suspicious behavior. This is an example in Connecticut, and again, just to point out that you have information here, no mechanism for sharing the information, so you really can't be sure what's going on. So in terms of the scope of the scheme, the types of container that are typically included are plastic bottles, metal cans, so aluminium and steel, and glass bottles. Cartons, so liquid paperboard cartons, they're included in some schemes, but not all. Foil pouches are also included, New South Wales as an example, but in many cases they're not excluded. And most schemes include most sizes. Now in the UK we have a consultation on a deposit scheme at the moment, and some bright spark decided that let's focus only on the smaller containers that we think might be covered, consumed on the go when people are out of home. Now, what this means is that, first of all, you reduce the ambition. You're only going to be targeting a fraction of the market. It will be done by introducing a size threshold. So all the producers close to that threshold will make their bottles slightly bigger to be outside of the scope. It's a kind of crazy scheme. It's a crazy proposal, but it has gained some traction with ministers who want to be seen to be innovative. But you want to have the broadest range of containers as possible. You get economies of scale. You have a number of fixed costs in a deposit system, and the larger the market, the more efficient it will be, all else being held equal. So in terms of the types of beverage, most systems include most types. Milk is often excluded, and there's various different reasons for that. In Iceland, it's political reasons because of farmers. Elsewhere, it's concerns about hygiene and maybe the smell of milk. That's not an insurmountable problem, so it is worth considering. Wine and other alcoholic drinks, they're sometimes excluded where they're more likely to be imported and in small numbers as well. So examples of this. Fraud is, as mentioned, it's an issue that's there, and obviously the level of the deposit will have an effect on the likelihood of people being incentivized to undertake fraudulent activity. But again, the deposit, along with a convenient take-back network, is a key mechanism for getting the desired return rate. So you've got to get a balance here. And the kind of fraud risk that's evident is that people might not initiate the deposit. They might put containers on the market without having paid the deposit to the system operator. You might have people trying to redeem, they might be trying to return their used beverage container multiple times to get multiple refunds. And you also may have people trying to return beverage containers that aren't within the system, trying to get their deposit back there. Setting the deposit level, it's a balance. You want to try and keep it in proportion to the overall cost of the beverage containers more generally. In the US, they tend to be very, very low, but this is in many cases because the systems were set up in the 1970s and the level of deposit was fixed in law and has not been increased since. So which means with inflation, there's over time a declining incentive. Interestingly, in some of the American states, the unredeemed deposits go to the state government. So the government has very little interest in increasing the return rate because they would get less money from the unredeemed deposits. In Germany, the deposit level is higher, and you get a proportionately higher return rate. So in terms of how you manage fraud, it depends in large part on the likelihood of fraud being present. So in a number of US states, the centers of population might be a long way away from other states where you have deposit systems, and there's less likelihood of cross-border movements of beverage containers of any significant scale. So they have a really basic system where you just have the logo, the abbreviation for the state, and the level of the deposit, which is different in different states. In Norway, there's a slightly higher risk of fraud. The deposit is higher, than the 5 cents in the States, and you have the risk of imports from elsewhere. So what they do, they have different barcodes, and they have the producer fee will vary. So those who use an international barcode will pay a slightly higher producer fee because this may have come from anywhere. Those that use a national barcode unique to Norway, they have a lower fee because it reduces the risk of a fraudulent redemption. And they also keep a close eye on the numbers. They keep a close eye on what's being put on the market, what is being returned for the refund. And because the data comes through very, very quickly, they can see if there's any issue. And retailers like this because those people who are minded to fraudulently return beverage containers are the people also likely to shoplift. So if you can detect them through the deposit system, raising the awareness of retailers that you have dishonest people in your stores, it helps both sides. So the data is really important, and this is where having a central system operator is key. Germany went for a different approach. They have many countries bordering them, others with deposits, and others without deposits. So they felt the need to go for a very secure system, and they have special links, and it does add considerably to the cost, but it is understood to be effective in preventing fraud. Difficulty with Germany is there's no central system operator, so it's difficult to get a clear view of the overall operation. But they have a much more expensive approach based on special links. So this is a chart from a couple of years ago looking at the relative wage levels and the cost of living in different countries and standardizing it to UK sterling for what the deposit level is and what the return rate is. It probably needs a little bit of updating, but the general trend is, as you'd expect, the higher the level of deposit, the higher the return rate that you will get. But it's not just the deposit level that's key. It's the return infrastructure. The convenience to consumers of returning the beverage containers. You could have a very high deposit level, but if you had only very few and inconvenient return locations, you wouldn't get such a high return rate. So the choice here, in broad terms, is between return to retail or return to a redemption centre away from where people go to shop. So for convenience, a return to retail is much more convenient, and it is associated with those higher return rates. If you want to get 90%, return to retail is the thing. There's then the choice of automated return using a reverse vending machine, or manual return, which is typically for the smaller stores where they just take the used beverage containers over the counter. Retailers are paid a handling fee to compensate for the time involved and the space involved and for the purchase of the RVMs if they purchase the RVMs. So the handling fee is based on a calculation and a process of negotiation to work out what is a fair level of compensation to be paid. And this is typically reviewed every year. One of the benefits of having reverse vending machines is that where they compact the containers, so the container we put in, they'll compact them. Firstly, that means they can't possibly be returned again for another redemption, so you reduce the likelihood of fraud. But also in terms of logistics. Now, Rauno mentioned that the switch from manual collection to RVMs meant they were able to save, was it 1,000 lorry trips every year? By increasing the bulk density, you reduce the volume and you make the system much more efficient. So this is why, when you look at the level of handling fees in different countries, a higher handling fee is paid for every container collected by retailers using a compacting machine, because it reduces the overall system costs. So again, this is something where the central system operator, which is owned by the retailers and the producers, they make that choice of how to continually optimize the system design. So where you have, in the US examples, the handling fee is set in law for retailers, no flexibility to amend it, it's no doubt, it's not surprising that no one's happy. None of the participants in the schemes are particularly happy. So the question of where it is, so in Norway, for example, anyone who sells beverage containers is required to take them back. Not all of them will necessarily register with the system as a point for collection, but some of the smaller kiosks might take them back as a service to their customers and then just go and put them in a reverse vending machine or hand them in elsewhere. But the key focus on the effective scheme is convenience for the consumers, but also considering the fairness to smaller retailers. Now in the UK, some of the small retailers think we will be forced to buy a reverse vending machine. That's not the case. That's misinformation they've been told. They have the choice. No one is making them put in place a reverse vending machine. It's a commercial calculation. They will look at the value of their space to them, the number of people who use their shop, and therefore the expected number of containers coming back. And they will make the calculation based on what the handling fee is as to what works best for them. The manual are automated. Again, this comes down to the initial costs, which will typically be through a loan, and the concerns about fraud. And again, it's for the system operator to provide the appropriate incentive to optimize the overall system. The manual return will tend to have a higher impact on employment because there's more staff time taken up with it, but the inverse of that is that it costs more because you're paying more for that. And ultimately it comes down to a question of overall cost, of which the logistics is a really significant part. So where redemption centres are put in place, they're often either run by the system operator or contracted businesses. So this is less convenient for consumers because they're returning them to a third place. They're not returning them to the place where they bought it. And it's less convenient, but you can have manual or automated returns. So the question of how the system is funded is obviously very important. One of the aspects is who owns the materials. Now the best practice is where the material is owned by the system operator and they're responsible for marketing that material. They will be providing a lot of material of very high quality and therefore be able to get a really good price for it. The revenues for that material are reinvested in the system and are used to reduce the net cost of the system and therefore reduce the fee that the producers will have to pay. So in Norway, for example, the material revenues cover about a third of the operating costs. Alternative approaches are used where sometimes the beverage companies will own the material or the retailers, but again, you're splitting this up. You don't get such a beneficial effect in terms of overall system cost reduction as you would where there's one ownership. So for handling fees, best practice approach is with a central system operator calculating the retailer's costs and looking to compensate for those, but also considering the wider costs of the system. And as I mentioned, these are typically subject to annual review or perhaps potentially more frequently as costs change. An alternative approach, again seen in some of the US systems, is where there are no handling fees or they're set too low and they're fixed, meaning the retailers are incurring a high cost and have got no incentive to encourage collection and they just don't have that investment in the system. Redemption centres, sometimes these aren't cost effective and they close, and this obviously affects the return rate. And I've already mentioned that when the fees are set in legislation, this creates an extra burden for trying to change and update them. You want to keep these aspects flexible. And also, there's political pressure to change the handling fees because when you have low return rates and the state gets the money back, they have no incentive to improve the overall performance. Not all the beverage containers will be returned. You have some deposits that will be unredeemed. So this is revenue that should stay within the system. And the best practice is where the system operator holds on to these unredeemed deposits, and this partially covers the cost of the system. So in Norway, you have a return rate of 90%, but the 10% of deposits that aren't returned cover 45% of the cost of the system. So these make quite a significant contribution. The alternative, as described earlier, is where unredeemed deposits go to the state, and this does not provide any incentive for the government to seek to hold the deposit system to the intended return rate or indeed to increase it. Now, producers will have to pay for the net costs of the system. Those aren't covered by the material revenues and the unredeemed deposits. So the best practice is for simply covering the minimum level to cover the net costs, and for it to be differentiated by container type. So you have different costs of dealing with different containers in the system. You have different revenues associated with the material. So this should be reflected back on a container type basis. It's also possible to use modulation, variation of fees to promote eco-design, and I have an example of this in a second. And the alternative to this is some systems where, again, producers cover the costs directly, and you have a flat rate fee for all, and then you have cross-subsidization of different materials, which is not the most effective. So in Norway, I mentioned earlier, we have lower producer fees for the use of a national barcode. But here you have, for example, you have the aluminium can, you have the producer fee basic, and then you have an additional fee if there's a plastic sleeve around it. So this is reflecting the costs of managing these at the end of life, and the additional costs in getting rid of the plastic sleeve, and any other contamination and issues this will cause. So for PET or HDPE bottles, you have a basic fee, but then you pay more if it's anything other than clear. So clear is the basic. For light blue, you pay more. You pay even more for other coloured. And then this is the reduction for the standard national barcode. So the costs of the system, the large chunk of costs are the handling fees to retailers. So this is a significant part of the system costs. About 3/4 typically will be covering the costs of return. You then have transport costs as the next biggest one. Counting centres, where you have manual return, you don't have a reverse vending machine, but the retailers just compensate by hand. You have to check that, so you have separate counting centres where you run it through a machine that counts and just checks they've given the right amount back. And you have a small amount of central admin costs and some fraud losses as well. So the funding, typically you'd have the unredeemed deposits covering about 1/3. You have material revenue, there's a green bit at the top, and then you have the producer fees covering the net costs of that. Now, if you're looking at, if you decide which beverage containers you want in the system, you have some beverage containers outside the system, and it's really important to maintain a level playing field to ensure there's no market distortion, and you don't have those within the system paying more than those outside the system, which could lead to a migration away from containers in the deposit system and to those that won't have such high rates of return. So in Norway, this is the way they did it. I mentioned that there was no mandatory deposit system in Norway. They simply put in place a really elegant tax solution. So at the bottom, you have a basic fee for any one-way container. This is to incentivize the use of refillables, so looking to prevent waste. So the basic fee is paid by everything placed on the market. You then have very high tax levels, one for bottles, which I think is 4.5 kroner, and then for cans is nearly 7 kroner. And you pay this for every bottle placed on the market if your return rate is less than 25%. From 25%, you start to get this linear reduction, and if you get to 95%, you pay no tax. So this really focused the minds of producers and said, well, this is what we're faced with. What is the most cost-effective way for us to minimize our tax burden here and to deliver the lowest costs overall? And they decided that a deposit system would be the least cost option for them. Now, importantly, what this does is this, and actually this is likely to be amended to get rid of the base tax, to only go to 0 at 100% to incentivize very high levels of return, and also to have an element based on the recycled content. So it will be another tax incentive to increase the incorporation of recycled content. Now, obviously, with a deposit return scheme, you get very clean material and very high levels of material returned. So you have the potential to incorporate a lot of recycled content from deposit schemes. And just a point that's worth noting on recycling rates. In the UK, we have people saying, well, we do pretty well on plastic recycling. We're at maybe 55% or thereabouts. We think it'd be good to get from 55% to 70. That'll be pretty good. And actually, no. Getting from 70 to 90 is so much better than from 50 to 70. And just to explain why, this is a chart looking at the cumulative impact of different levels of recycling rates. So imagine you start with enough material for 1,000 bottles. If you have a 10% recycling rate, in the first round of recycling, you'll get enough material for 100 bottles. And then in the second round, you get enough material for 10 bottles. And then the third round, you get enough material for 1 bottle. At 90%, you start with 1,000. Then the first round of recycling, you get enough material back for 900 bottles. Then third round, you get enough material back for 810 bottles, and so on. So it's a little bit like compound interest in your bank account. You know, the higher return rate has a really significant impact on material efficiency. So what you can see, you move from 80% to 90%, and the reduction in requirement for virgin material is really significant. So if you can get a system in place where you're getting 90%, it makes a massive difference in the avoided need for primary material. So, and it's popular with the public. I think where schemes are in place, we've seen some concern before, well, maybe that's changed. I think before awareness of marine plastic pollution, there was some trepidation about a deposit scheme being difficult, but when they're in place, people say, well, yeah, we don't know why we didn't have this earlier. We want to stick with it. You know, it touches on all these issues of litter, single-use packaging, and as Rano mentioned, it makes people think more broadly about their resource use. And for stakeholders, for the beverage industry, it's an effective means to implement genuine producer responsibility, genuinely covering all the costs. The efficient design and the ability to continue improving it minimizes the costs and allows further improvements over time. You get really high quality material for new containers. For the retailers, they're compensated through the handling fee. It's a touch point for customer engagement, and people will bring the bottles back to the same store, is often the case, and you get that customer footfall. And for the government, you get improved recycling rates, progress towards targets, reduced residual waste, so less stuff going to landfill or incineration. And for plastics, if you put plastics in incinerators, that's really bad from a greenhouse gas perspective. You're effectively burning fossil fuels in a low efficiency combustion process. It also saves on the costs of litter cleanup. And final point, the costs of waste are borne by those creating it, by the consumers and the producers, rather than the citizens and the taxpayers. So the general taxpayer does not anymore have to cover these costs. Thank you very much.